Contra III: The Alien Wars is a sci-fi action game developed and published by Konami. It was released on the Super Nintendo in 1992 and is the third entry in the Contra series of games, the first two of which appeared on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Last season, the original Contra was inducted into the Academy's Hall of Fame, while the second entry, Super C, took the Silver Award for Best Gameplay, Challenge, and Achievement. This third entry earned a much more promising standing with 5 nominations, including Best Pixel 1992, Best Level Design, Best Gameplay, Challenge and Achievement, Best Technical Artistry, and Best Original Score. Tonight, I'm joined by Noah. Noah's a new Academy member this year. Noah, thanks for jumping on board.
Well, thanks for inviting me, man. I'm really happy to be here.
Nice. So let's give a little background on Contra. So what's your experiences with the game?
Well, I'm kind of new to Contra as well as old 1990 games. So I first started with Contra 1, and I really enjoyed it. And so I decided to play Contra 3, which I enjoyed even more, although I wasn't able to quite finish it. But I love like the artistry as well as like with the bosses. I think they have really cool designs. I love how over the top the game is, where it's kind of like, it really is just 80s action hero, the video game. And I think that's just like really cool and memorable.
Yeah, I love anything 80s and cheesy and actiony and sci-fi. It's basically a smorgasbord of all of my favorite things. Yeah, we actually talked a decent amount about playing the game. Contra is, of course, one of my personal favorites from when I was a kid. But this entry I didn't actually play, and I didn't play Super C until last season either. I just the original. That's a childhood memory of mine. And then I really enjoyed Super C like last year, and this one, I think I have a kind of interesting experience because I originally played it when I got my Super Nintendo Classic Edition. And the first time I tried going through it, I just got slaughtered because the game was so adrenaline, like fast-paced and intense. I couldn't keep up with it. The speed that it wanted me to do, I just wasn't able to do. And then now going back and revisiting it and beating it a couple times, I've acclimated and I get with the rhythm of it. It's a very just intense game for the Super Nintendo. It's one of the like strongest performing games in terms of just raw technical prowess, I feel, because it runs so smooth.
Yeah, I was really impressed with that, but yeah, it was really tough for me. I'm not big into these 2D games.
Yeah, you're more of a first-person shooter, right?
But it was really quite an experience. Like, it was really tough, but I enjoyed playing through it.
Yeah. I think I'm going to jump in a little bit because with some of our points, because I feel like more is going to come up in our conversation as we get into the meat of it. So the storyline for Contra games are not something anyone would consider rich. I think that's fair. There's not much depth, complexity, or enough emphasis in general to warrant a lengthier discussion. People are content to accept that the aesthetic of these games is all about having you play through an action B-horror film from American cinema of the 1980s. Rambo, Terminator, Alien, Die Hard, Predator. These inspirations are all on full display, but the games justifiably don't cater to the actual storylines of these movies. They aren't as brain-dead as to simplify the narratives into nuance, into nauseating action drivel either, though. At a glance, you might mistakenly see Contra as that drivel. The opening line of "let's attack aggressively" is not exactly Shakespeare, but it is referencing its sources of inspiration to properly set the stage for how this experience is meant to be understood. And that's the core strength that Contra 3 does incredibly well. It's not so much the story it tells, but rather the context. Justifications aside, this is a finely polished thrill ride that goes from one action set piece to the next with only the sparsest moments to breathe. And while we generally look for artistic nuance in games, there's also something to be said for fine craftsmanship and genuine player enjoyment. And in this respect, Contra 3 has perhaps no other competitor from the entire 1992 year, and I will be happy to go on record with that. And that's not just hyperbole either, taking a quick look at the nominees for Best Pixel. And while good games, none of them quite pack the same degree of production showmanship and immediately gratifying good-natured fun. So let's get into our first category with level design. The opening stage sees the player traversing through a destroyed city that might resemble something similar to what a metropolitan area in the early days of Skynet's takeover might look like. The opening cinematic shows an atomic bomb, or an equivalent, reducing the city into basic structures and rubble. To go from that into actually being boots on the ground is a smooth transition that other games should probably be jealous of. It reminds me of the opening for Terminator 2. You've seen that one,
Yes,
right?
I have.
Yeah.
As soon as I saw the intro, I was like, oh, this is totally Terminator. Like, a bomb blowing everyone up, and then there's, like, cyborgs and aliens coming to invade. I'm like, that instantly, it, like, drew me in as well. I'm like, okay, this is interesting compared to the first Contra where you get thrown into it.
Yeah, you can even see that opening cutscene in one of two ways. Either it's a briefing for the mission, or it's more theatrical than that, establishing an extraterrestrial threat that will be revealed later in the story. This entire structure isn't that dissimilar from how Castlevania 4 opened with the prologue of Dracula rising from his grave. That game didn't show you Dracula either, and this trick of keeping your cards close to your chest before you reveal the final boss is a good one. There was more story set up last time, but frankly, how much of that text was actually needed?
Well, another thing I really noticed about the game was how the characters were influenced by, the 80s action heroes as well. The blue character being Arnold Schwarzenegger in Predator, and then the red one being Rambo from his second film. So
Yeah.
I really liked how they kind of drew inspiration from those movies.
Yeah, it creates a really good, theming that doesn't require them to have to explain so much story details. Because if you don't, I would argue, I guess, that if you didn't have such a very clear source of inspiration, that you'd have a lot more groundwork to do to establish what's going on. But because it has these reference points, it's easier for people to get interested because you immediately pick up what it's trying to do, and it sort of focuses on, here's the gameplay first, and never mind these other aesthetics. This is what those movies would have looked like had they been in a game format, basically. Yeah. And when I spoke about Super C last season, I said they had taken the formula of original Contra and cranked it up to 11. To give you a sense for how Contra 3 feels, it's like they took Super C and cranked that up to 25. I somehow managed to not grow up playing this game. I don't even remember seeing it at rental stores, though the Super Nintendo and I share the same birthday, so they were mostly vanishing by the time I was old enough to be interested in the system. When I eventually did play it, it blew my mind. I couldn't even reach the first boss because I was so unfamiliar with how fast everything performed that I just couldn't keep up. I've heard since that generally you're supposed to play this on the easy setting, then normal, and then hard. And this is actually reinforced by the designers. After you complete the game, it ushers you into a second playthrough on a harder setting, and even the on-screen text encourages you to take the game on again. Even though it's so short, there is an indication that you're supposed to do a warm-up run and then play it at a harder difficulty and then a harder one and kind of push yourself.
Let me tell you, I wish I knew that because I got tore up going into normal mode.
Yeah, normal mode is not for the faint of heart. Even though it says normal, if you're not used to it or haven't played it in a while, yeah, just no shame. Go to easy. Easy is quite literally what you're supposed to start with, honestly. Because the game only has 4 main stages. There are 2 others, but those are more like bonus stages since they are played from a top-down perspective and are much shorter. They mostly serve as bookends, occurring after the first stage and before the final stage of the game. In each instance, the bonus stages are visually distinct, with the first taking on the appearance of a freeway, while the latter one is some kind of breeding ground for alien spiders, a sign that you're getting much closer to the hive. Structurally, this is very sound, but what about the individual levels? Well, as you can probably tell just from watching, these are some of the most jaw-dropping stages of any game, period. There are the usual mechanical concerns, such as the first stage, which prioritizes safe platforms that the player can use to get a reprieve, that are understandably absent in future levels. The challenge appropriately grows with the first stage having this platform sequence where you have to avoid the flames and no enemies. When this occurs again in stage 4, the platforms are moving and periodically being destroyed. And did I mention that the platforms are actual rockets? You are holding onto a missile in flight with one hand while firing an automatic rifle with the other. And you're jumping, letting go of one rocket before it detonates and grabbing onto another one mid-flight. Just stop for a second and look what's happening here. Not even if you had superpowers can anyone feasibly do this in real life, but that's how Contra flexes, man.
Dude, the portion of the level where you jump from missile to missile was so over the top and stupid, and that's why I remember it so well, and I love that part. It's so random, and I would never expect it, and it was just, it was really interesting because you went from riding on a helicopter to then jumping from missile to missile, and it was just so drastic of a change.
And it happens so organically in game. I think nowadays, if you did that in a movie or a big budget game with enhanced graphics, it would be much easier to see that transition and be wowed by it. I'm thinking of like Doom and a lot of the sequences they have in those. But in 16-bit pixels, I think I didn't quite register what was happening the first few playthroughs. Then in hindsight, I was like, I'm literally holding on to a missile. This is ridiculous. Like, they know what it is. They're not stupid. And they're designing this. They're like, yeah, he just launches on the missile. And then they turn that into like a playable sequence. It's crazy. Because, I mean, why not have you just hanging onto the helicopter from earlier? Why? Because why do that when you can flow from one scene into the next from being launched from the rocket? Honestly, this entire stage could be nominated alone. It starts with the player riding a motorcycle, shooting down airborne enemies who lob grenades and rain down gunfire. Then you exit the tunnel, a visual trick that shouldn't be possible on the hardware, but somehow is. And then you have to fight a tank, which is flanked by new airborne units. Then you're driving under a battleship, taking out its guns and reinforcements. Then you have a mini-boss. And then you get picked up by the helicopter where you have to fight a grapple hook ninja just out of nowhere. And finally, you are launched to take down the battleship for good. This entire sequence is basically a self-contained narrative all on its own, and every main stage follows a similar design philosophy. Allegedly, the director wanted there to be something new for the player to experience every 3 screens worth of movement. And when you play the game, you're so overstimulated and busting your mind to react to everything happening, it might be hard to forget how constant the flow from one encounter to the next becomes, but it is really quite commendable. I think his efforts paid off to make it for just one hell of a ride. Did you have any other thoughts on level design, or should I take us into technical artistry?
Let's go into technical artistry.
All right, so part of what makes all these compelling stages so remarkable is the technical chops to pull them off. This game's run at a fairly constant 60 frames per second, and with so many enemies and chaos happening at once, it's really a marvel to experience. Contra has never steered away from making a big spectacle out of its exciting encounters, and here is no different. There's full-on parallax scrolling in a host of stages, with probably the most noticeable, and in fact the most noticeable showcase of technical engineering is in fact that tunnel stage. Now, I'm not a tech expert, so forgive me if some of this is incorrect, but from my research, the Super Nintendo has access to 4 visual layers. One layer is for the character sprites, one layer is for the status bar with your lives and equipped guns, which means you're left with only 2 layers to work with for the environment, typically a background and a foreground. And what most games on the system will do is make a static image for the background. You can see it here in Mega Man X. But when you get to the tunnel stage, you have the tunnel itself, which then vanishes when you exit, making room for an open desert background. The refresh speed has to then slow down to better simulate how we perceive reality. And they do have to be mixed because the road exits in both scenes. So finding a way for the speed to be felt in one sense and then dramatically altered the next is really just a spectacular show of design. And this isn't even accounting for the parallax scrolling that the clouds are doing, and the fact that the scene goes on to include a carrier ship and a helicopter.
Another part of the game that I was really surprised with the technical artistry was when you first fight the robot, because he literally just tears from the background into the game, which I thought, which really surprised me, and I was like, this is really cool, because really the only other game I played was Castlevania 4, and all the bosses kind of just spawned in, or they walked in from the right, but this one literally came in from the center of the world, and I was like, this is really cool.
Yeah, I think I probably should make sure that's clear for everyone listening, is that like this is a similar team that designed Castlevania 4 last year, and even though its nomination count isn't quite as high, there is clearly a step up in their execution, at least in the sense that I've heard they kind of struggled with Castlevania 4 in a few places, specifically with the frame rate, because they just weren't fully aware of how the Super Nintendo hardware worked. And by the time Contra came around, they had figured it out. And so they were able to execute on ideas that are more ambitious, like the Terminator machine just crashing through the wall. I actually like the end part too, where he like pulls both doors and then it slices his head off. Yeah. It's just like there's so much presentation, there's so much thought into making each sequence memorable that, I mean, this is why Konami was inducted last year, is that they're just masters at their craft, or at least they were back in the day.
Technical artistry is a very interesting category this year. It might actually be my favorite because each nominee has a truly unique claim to the trophy. But where the other games implement something novel, something that the gaming landscape hadn't seen prior to then, Contra 3 is the one nominee whose angle is more concerned with polish and refinement. We saw last session how Castlevania 4, while technically very interesting from a thematic perspective, did suffer from frame rates issues. Now it's clear the Konami team rapidly learned how to work with Super Nintendo hardware, and perhaps no other game demonstrates this.
This isn't necessarily the most showy of the nominees either, but it is a very grounding pick, I would say. It's one that does exactly what it sets out to do, and what it sets out to do is within the scope of what we've seen before, but not to this extreme degree. Normally, I would think level design and gameplay are a useful conversation match, but this time I felt level design and technical artistry worked well together because you really can't achieve the frantic intensity of these stages without properly optimizing the game. Castlevania 4 was a slower-based game, so it was less important how much polish its technical chops needed to be. Here, with Contra, it's practically the main event and a linchpin in paving a route to its Best Pixel nomination. Well, should we move on to that gameplay challenge and achievement category then?
Let's do it.
So, to start things off, there's a good variety of weapons that are optimal for different situations. While you can and probably do want to optimize, you don't need to, so you can use whatever you like and lean on that for most of the game. After you beat the game, it rolls you over into the start on the harder difficulty, suggesting it's meant to be played across 2 to 3-ish playthroughs. You have a warm-up run before things get really heated. It is a very short game, like we said before, so leveraging the value of each playthrough like this is really good. It's also nice that it's short because it sort of simulates that blockbuster movie experience by being played in around 1.5 to 2 hours. The harder difficulties do ramp up the gameplay in interesting ways. Some bosses will need to be dealt with by destroying all of their body parts as opposed to just their weak points, while still others will send out a trailing centipede that before wouldn't be able to move around the map independently. It's very difficult to describe how this game gets into your bloodstream, but to make a comparison, this is an all-encompassing reaction-heavy shooter. It's one-hit deaths, but mercifully you can carry a backup weapon. You've also got only a limited number of lives, so basically when you're plowing through enemies without taking a scratch, you feel empowered, but that's legitimately the only way to actually win. If you had a health bar, you could make a great many more mistakes, but that would encourage a type of play that sees the player get sloppy and disinterested because you wouldn't have to do well to make progress. And remember, Castlevania 4 had a health bar and a password system to pick up where you left off, so it's not like the developers weren't aware of this kind of do-or-die situation they were creating. In Castlevania 4, a large part of the appeal is the journey, so a password is a welcome addition. That game is like wine, and this is like taking a shot. It's brief, intense, and not something you want all the time, but it does hit the spot.
There are mini bosses galore in this game. Tanks, jets, machines, even the final boss is a series of 5 separate boss fights, 6 including the secret boss, which only appears on harder difficulty. The game flows quite simply, absolute excellent. You're never fighting the same enemy for too long, nor does it change so quickly that you can't keep up. It takes some adjustment, but that's only because we are conditioned to have games follow predictable flow. Contra is widely unpredictable, endlessly inventive, with unique enemy designs and encounters at each stage. Basically amounts to a massive action set piece in a big budget Hollywood film. And that was interesting because the idea was to up the ridiculousness factor. This is essentially Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, a film that put the other horror movies to shame. It took a B plot but tells it shockingly well that suddenly it means more to us because we can actually see the vision in a more clear and enjoyable way. The development team behind Contra 3 may have been inspired to make it akin to a B movie, but being very good at their job means the game actually goes toe-to-toe with actually competent blockbuster films. And the final way in which this is accomplished is through the music.
This isn't game music. This is a fully realized original score. Asunori Adachi was a lead composer on Castlevania 4, taking one music win out of a record 3 nominations last season. While I can't say for certain how much influence he had on that score, nor this one, what I can say is, like Castlevania, Contra's score is a significant improvement over its 8-bit original. This time, the focus is on creating horror, suspense, and action-fueled drama, but the influence from film scores is ever present in both. I think starting at the beginning is a good measure of how much contribution the music adds. Watch the opening cutscene without music and compare.
It begins with an ominous rumbling, almost like a heartbeat. Then there's a climax to correlate with the arrival of the alien threat, and it ends by introducing the main theme in conjunction with the other two playable protagonists. I think it's easy to take the opening cutscene for granted, but remember that very few games from this time are this efficient at establishing the premise and getting the vibe going in a syncly manner. It's cheesy writing, yes, but that's the point. The game's vision is so wholly and completely embraced that. Eventually, you have to give into it. The music originally leads itself in a Stage 1 theme, Ground Zeroes. Some things I want you to listen for are the rising tension with each chord, and the mixture of high and low percussions.
When the track eventually loops back around, it's hardly noticeable because it's essentially capturing a menagerie of motions you might hear during a big shootout in an action movie. Game music has the unique challenge of trying to orient the player with the tone and pacing of the events going on in-game, but it's complicated to design for in that it isn't stagnant like a film. So how do you recreate the likes of a Terminator or Die Hard epic, knowing that you can't control the exact moment when something will appear on screen or be defeated or what have you? The answer was to ensure you have enough of the various motions from those scenes strung together in such a way as to have them be present but not so dominant that the player won't find anything jarring. In other words, all of the score's different strengths can fit the entire stage, and so by linking them together and using simple rising repetition, it builds energy and takes breaths to rebuild intensity again. It's raw music in service of the events of the game world and the player's actions. There was no way in hell I was going into this season without Contra getting a best score nom. While Ground Zero is a perfect composition, the others are equally great at accomplishing the same feats. So I want to use this chance to actually talk about the boss, especially the finale music. Now, this is not the kind of music you would listen to just passively, but that's a good thing. The music is firmly rooted in helping craft the emotional waves the player is going to experience throughout the game. This track is called the Final Gauntlet, and it is broken up into multiple parts, one for each of the series of final bosses in the finale. Listen for the usage of empty space and the complete lack of heroism. This track is meant to instill a sense of horror, like discovering a hideous alien monstrosity.
Typically, when you beat the boss, you'll hear the Contra theme play during the stage clear screen. But since this is a rush of bosses, you're pushed into fighting the next horror. The transition after beating this boss in particular is fantastic. They are two separate tracks, but the rush of strings that open the second gauntlet is where you hear it, and has a specific point at which the composers intend for the transition to happen. Here are two different recordings Mitch did where you can hear the track shift. The first one happens immediately when the boss dies, while the second is delayed.
It seamlessly flows from one impactful game sequence to the next, elevating the game experience without calling attention to itself in a self-indulgent way. The music is not noticeable. In fact, I doubt you would have noticed that transition had I not pointed it out just now. What you would have picked up on is the dread, desperation, and any other emotions you'd have felt during the play experience. And that's what makes it so commendable. But my last example is the track that comes from the final boss rush. As a comparison with Ground Zeroes, this track plays as the last march into the heart of the storm. Military heroism comes in full force, but I think you'll agree that desperation plays a much larger role this time. And how fitting. This is the final stretch. It might have been tempting to go with a quiet, eerie piece here, but the energy they have better matches the other tracks we hear in-game, making the score a connective tissue. I said before there isn't much of a story, but the context is strong and the music is a huge contributing factor to giving a semblance of story subtly conveyed as we saw with Castlevania IV. Despite the over-the-top ridiculousness of some of its finer moments, the score for Contra III doesn't feel the need to join in on the fun. None of the sounds are cartoonish, they take the narrative through line very seriously, and I think that creates good balance with the visuals. So I think that wraps up most of our kind of scripted thoughts for its categories, so it's time to talk about Best Pixel, eh? So I would say, to kick things off, that the narrative through line is both less important and also less pronounced here than it was with Castlevania IV. Even though Castlevania wasn't a contender in any of our theatrical categories last year, it had other important markers that made its case for Best Pixel much stronger. For example, it had a nomination for Best Direction, which involves some story-related nuance, and it also had 4 audio nominations, sound, score, and 2 Best Track noms, which is just an excellent overall performance. On the one hand, it's a bit excessive, but I think it simultaneously gave the Academy as well as listeners a clear foundation. And remember, it was up against some bona fide classics such as Final Fantasy IV and Zelda: A Link to the Past, neither of which came in anywhere near a dozen nominations. I draw these comparisons because Contra III has as much of the same development team as Castlevania, including a shared composer and shared producer. As for the competition, though, the 92 Pixel nominees are all on relatively equal footing with one another where nominations are concerned. So at the moment, it's really anyone's game. Contra III is reminiscent of one of those early Best Picture winners, something like Wings, for example, in which the movie itself is okay, but really it's winning because it is an outstanding production. It does something bold, the medium actually manages to pull it off, and therein lies its path to victory. So, in other words, Contra is sort of doing this, but it is also somewhat reserved in that it does what it does well, not necessarily in such a shockingly new way. Yes, it's an action movie in game form, but that's mostly where its quote-unquote artistry ends. It's an excellent production that puts other games from the era to absolute shame, perhaps making it a somewhat conventional pick. The Academy is still too young to know how the voters will feel, but I do feel its best chance is to win by dissemination. The voters can't agree on what should win because of the relative equal standing. You can't really go wrong with a tried and true mixture of design and aesthetic enjoyability. So have I made you a fan out of Contra by now?
Yeah, once I started looking through the script and watching more videos on it, I was like, this game is actually quite cool.
I mean, I think that's the other thing to go back on for Best Pixel as well, is just that it is good-natured fun. We actually had an extended conversation. I was talking with some other Academy members, and I was originally considering Assault Suits for its Best Pixel nomination because of its good direction. But we were kind of went back and forth, and mind you, these were members that are not super into action shooting kind of games. So they were fairly unbiased, I think. And as we were talking, they were like, there is something to be said for the game being just straight up fun. And that's like a really important conversation in game design and sort of artistic philosophy in general, is that video games seem to have this need to be fun where other art forms don't actually care. And I don't know that we have quite the examples that are going to come in future years that will really push against that issue. But I do think that most great pieces of art are enjoyable in some way, even in their grotesque sense, right? So, the fact that Contra is just so downright enjoyable, it'd be kind of a shame and a lackluster effort on our part, I think, if it was absent from the best pixel list.
Totally. And I feel like there's not too many games from 1992 that compare with Contra 3.
Yeah.
To not only its style, but also just like its performance.
Yeah, and I would even say, and this was, maybe others disagree, but a lot of us, I think, at the Academy, I know Corbett and I especially felt like 92 was a bit of a weaker year. There was definitely some good stuff in there, but it wasn't on the level that got us quite as excited as some other years. And I think that is reflective by looking at how all the Pixel nominees are like in the same kind of mid-tier level of performance. So it's like right in there. And I feel like, yeah, I don't know. It's definitely the pick that changes up the rest of, like, if you were playing through all of the 5 contenders in a row and you got to this one, it's going to be this like, wow, well, that was just a freaking great time. And there's definitely something to be said for that, even if it kind of, I guess, speaks for itself better than we can do here in words. So, with that said, if you're curious to play Contra 3 yourself, there is the Super Nintendo version, the Super Nintendo Classic, or as part of the Contra collection across all modern platforms. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us tonight. Contra 3 is up for 5 rewards at this year's Oscarinas. Thank you, Noah, for joining me and talking about Contra, and welcome aboard.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm going to have a blast here.
Sounds good. And if Contra 3 The Alien Wars wins Best Pixel, it will elevate the power of player experience through one hell of an outstanding production.